Rajeshwari began the first panel this morning with a quote from George Bernard Shaw on how when there are many economists, there is never any consensus. This panel is kind of lawyer heavy, so no prizes for guessing on what the consensus is going to be over here. So what is the story of Indian finance? The story of Indian finance is that India made an early entry in finance. The INR was the de facto currency in some of the countries in the Middle East until the 1960s. It was actually the official tender in Oman and Muscat well until the 1970s. BSE was Asia's first stock exchange. Particularly in the 1990s, along with the general theme of economic liberalization, we saw a lot of activity in the financial sector itself. NSE became the first demutualized and electronic exchange in India. Actually, it's one of the earliest electronic exchanges in the world. And to get some perspective, Toronto went electronic only in 1997. Tokyo went electronic only in 1999. We saw a lot of changes on the regulatory and legal front. SEBI replaced the control of capital issues, FEMA replaced FERA, and the insurance sector was opened up to private participation. To cut a long story short, the 1990s, actually, the decade gave us a platform for mobilizing our savings and channelizing them into investment. Then what happened? Most of India, even today, is cut off from the formal financial sector. As Mr. Bijur mentioned in the morning, except for perhaps the first 1,000 companies in the country, the cost of credit for the others is exorbitant. Like he mentioned, the masala bonds are actually being sold at are fetching a much better price than what one could have raised in the domestic bond market. We have an underdeveloped bond market. People still extensively rely on bank financing and the very expensive equity market. Banks are obviously in stress as a result. And our financial intermediation systems are not working well enough to channelize our savings into infrastructure. Of course, rampant mis-selling of financial products, and I will talk about that a bit more later. We have governance issues of market infrastructure, and we have barriers to innovation and competition. So what happened? What did we do about this? Like any other bureaucratic administration, we set up committees. And I can mention about 5 committees which actually recommended structural reform to financial regulatory architecture. For example, if you look at the Percy Mystery Committee, it made recommendations for a unified market for organized financial trading. If we look at the UK Sinha-led working group on foreign investment, it made recommendations on structural reforms to FEMA such that foreign capital flows are allowed not on the basis of who invests or what is the instrument of investment, but are supported, the controls, if any, are supported by an economic rationale. The takeaway from these committees really was that a lot of this would require amendments to the law. And we did see some amendments to the law in the last 18 to 20 months. To begin with, I mean, of course, there's the Bankruptcy Code, which replaced our archaic Insolvency Acts of 1907. We saw some reform in the bond market. For example, SARFAESI, which allows a secured creditor to enforce his security without going to court, is now even available to secured bondholders. We saw the regulatory convergence of the commodities and securities markets, where FMC merged into SEBI, and now SEBI regulates securities and commodities. We saw a rehaul of the monetary policy framework, which Rajeshwari and the panel spoke about in the morning. Finally, we have a nominal anchor, and we have an institutionalized decision-making process for our monetary policy actions. And we did see some limited rationalization of external commercial borrowings, where we saw that rupee inflows are liberalized and to a large extent, and long-term debt is being encouraged. So this is what we saw over the last 18 to 20 months. Now, the question really is this enough? And what is left? So my submission here is that, when you're really measuring something that you want, you only get what you measure. So, for example, in consumer protection, have we fixed the legal framework for consumer protection in the financial sector? I must refer to a recent research study which involved a mystery shopping exercise. What does that mean? It means that the researchers or the surveyors, they walked into banks, posing as consumers who wanted a financial product, and this is what they found. They found that bank managers make no attempt to do any suitability assessment of the consumer. They sell you the product that they want to sell you, irrespective of what your financial portfolio and circumstances are like. What did they find? They found that private banks end up selling insurance products more often than not because it's a high commission product for them. Public sector banks end up selling fixed deposits more often than not because it's a high commission product for them. Have we seen much improvement on financial inclusion? So for example, just to get some context, I mean, we have these differential payment banking licenses, we have the on-tap banking license framework, which has now been put up. But just to get some perspective, we have a total of 93 commercial banks in India. Any guesses on the number of banks that are licensed annually, on an average, in the US? Any wild guess? Any number? 100. No. As of, okay, so it is about the average number of banks that get licensed in the US is about 159 a year. Now, one may argue that, okay, but in the 2008 crisis, more banks shut down than before, et cetera, but that's a story for another day because that doesn't really, it's not a causation between the crisis and the number of banks. On FEMA, have we seen an improvement? Can we say that a Docomo will be able to take back its capital out of the country, or even the written down value of its capital out of the country without running from pillar to post? I don't think so. I don't think we have confident answers for any of these questions. So what needs to be fixed? My submission is that the reforms are actually can be bucketed into 3 buckets: the legal architecture, implementation, and governance issues, or what people spoke about in the morning, rule of law. On legal architecture or governing our financial system is still archaic. It is not written for an economy that is growing at a pace of 7.5% or an economy of the size of 2 trillion. So my favorite example in this is the Banking Regulation Act of 1949. You know, one of the grounds which RBI has to consider when an application for a banking license is made to it is what is the impact of the new bank on the local operations of an existing bank? Is it possible to expand existing banks instead of licensing new ones? So this is fundamentally anti-competitive, and this is one of the many egregious examples that one could come across in a law as old as 1949. Actually, the problem is not only with old laws. I mean, even if I could refer to some examples from the Companies Act of 2013. Even today, under the Companies Act of 2013, when a minority shareholder makes an application for oppression or mismanagement, protesting against it, the tribunal has the power to wind up the company on grounds that are just and equitable. Winding up is essentially the decision of creditors and shareholders. There is no reason why the primary law of a country should allow a tribunal to wind up a company on grounds that are just and equitable. So this is what I mean by archaic legal architecture. And when I say archaic, I don't only mean in terms of which year it was enacted. I mean archaic in terms of archaic ideology or archaic philosophy. Inadequate laws. So the complaint is always that, you know, we have too many laws, and there was a 100 laws repeal project that was started, etc. But in some areas, we have no laws at all. So for example, in 2015, the Finance Ministry set up a task force to set up a financial redress agency. What's a financial redress agency? It's a unified ombudsman for grievance of redressal of consumers of financial products. So tomorrow, if I think that a ULIP has been missold to me, I don't have to think whether I have to go to the IRD ombudsman, or do I have to go to the SEBI ombudsman, or do I have to go to the RBI ombudsman. It's a unified redress agency. I go there, they figure it out. But the question is that if there is no law which really gives the financial redress agency the teeth to do what it wants, then how is it even going to function? Third is inconsistent laws. Classic example is SARFAESI, inconsistency between SARFAESI and the bankruptcy code. The trigger point for triggering an insolvency resolution process under the bankruptcy code is different from the trigger point for triggering the enforcement process under SARFAESI. It creates clear arbitrage situations between the two laws. On implementation, again, in the morning, a lot of emphasis was laid on implementation of projects, implementation of ideas, etc. how well are we implementing the ideas that are already out there, and half of them which have already taken some legal form? It has been over a year since FMC has merged into SEBI. We haven't seen convergence of intermediaries. That means securities firms are different from commodities firms. We haven't seen convergence of the exchange segments. All of this actually adds to cost of doing business and also to the cost of actually entering into financial transactions. We haven't seen many new commodity products. So this is where we are floundering on implementation. Similarly, implementation of the bankruptcy code, which relies so extensively on the capability of the NCLT. How much have we done to really equip the NCLT to discharge its job? The third topic is everybody's favorite, right? Rule of law. So what do we mean by rule of law? And I was we were discussing during lunch that rule of law is such an abstract concept that it needs examples and enumeration. So one example is ad hoc administration of the law. So for example, let's take the example of FEMA. Under FEMA, if a foreign investor wants to invest in brownfield pharma in India, and there is a non-compete clause in his agreement, he needs to go to the FIPB to get it sanctioned. This is ad hoc administration of the law. You either allow non-compete or you don't allow non-compete, and the wisdom of either can be argued out in life. But you cannot expect parties to keep going back to the government or the regulator every time they have to take money in or bring money in or take money out. Regulatory governance issues is quasi-legislative instruments are routinely issued without consultation or without responding to why some feedback was taken and why some feedback was not taken, if at all any feedback was taken. Appeal processes. Even today, appeals from the orders of the RBI lie to the central government. It is extremely irrational to do this, where appeals from every other regulator are lying to a quasi-judicial tribunal. It defeats the fundamental principles of natural justice. It defeats the idea of the Constitution of separation between the executive and the judiciary. So my conclusion is that we began well in the 1990s. We did some reforms in the last 18 to 20 months. But well begun is not always half done. And we must measure outcomes instead of outputs. What do I mean by that? So for example, if the bankruptcy code has been enacted in 2015, 3 years down the line, one must see the size of the credit market to see if the code is working or not. That is an output. The code is the outcome. Distinguish between incremental and structural reforms. We saw some reforms in the corporate bond market, which we can talk about on the panel. My submission is that they are incremental and not at all structural. And of course, implementation is the key to everything. Thank you.